Brave New World, the BSR's architecture program, focuses on the younger generation, often known as millennials. Last month, Reinier de Graaf, a Dutch architect, urbanist and writer, opened the program with a brilliant, if somber lecture in which he described the world that this younger generation has inherited. A world with a demising state, increasing wealth inequality, unstable working conditions and an unaffordable housing. Finn Harper is about to give the second introductory talk of the series. Finn is an architecture critic and vice director of the Architecture Foundation and is an authority on his generation. His lecture will not only describe the big changes that he sees in the role of the architect, but also societal changes in general. Finn will be introduced by Luca Gallofaro, an architect, curator and university professor who also runs Campo, an extremely active architects' cultural space. Finally, we'd like to thank all those who make the architecture program possible. Brave New World was co-sponsored by Alford Hall Moningham Morris, Bennett's Associates, the Marcus Trust, Eric Parry Architects and the John S. Cohn Foundation, with additional support from Jamie Fovert Architects, the Brian Guinness Charitable Trust, the Embassy of the Netherlands and Carmody Groke.
Signore e signori, grazie a nome di tutta la nostra comunità per la vostra presenza qui dall'Accademia Britannica. Accogliervi qui stasera ci dà il più pieno piacere. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the British School at Rome. A very warm welcome. Just on behalf of our community, for me to say very shortly and very sweetly what a pleasure, a privilege and a joy it is for me to be able to introduce the second instalment of the British School at Rome's architecture programme, entitled Brave New World, and curated, of course, by the wonderful Marina Engel, who handles all things architectural here at the British School at Rome. True to form, Marina has written a very timely programme. It's a programme that's going to look at an emerging generation of architects, what distinguishes them, how they're striving to find new ways to design the built environment that reflect more appropriately pressing social and economic needs of the day. There could be nobody more appropriate or esteemed to speak to this topic than our guest tonight, Phineas Harper, who himself a fellow millennial, the very brilliant director of the AEF and a preeminent authority on architects of this generation. Phineas gives the second talk, following on from Reinier de Graaf, which will set the scene for a series of events, 3 exhibitions and roundtable events featuring younger architects, which will kick off this autumn. To introduce tonight's speaker and tonight's proceedings in a little more detail, we're very pleased to welcome back to the BSR, a great friend of the British School at Rome, Luca Gallofaro, who is co-director of Campo, which will be well known to all of you as one of the most lively, dynamic, creative spaces run by architects, and who exhibited here at the British School at Rome in 2010 with his previous practice, Ian Pugh. So without further ado from me, I extend a very warm welcome to you all and to our 2 contributors tonight for this exciting event. Thank you.
I don't want to, I want just to say 2 or 3 things very fast, because I think that it's more interesting to discuss, because I'm here, I accept to be here just because I really want to discuss with our guest, because I spent almost 25 years to build the first 3 lines of his curriculum. So I'm very curious, this is why I asked you, because he's the director of, deputy director of the Architectural Foundation in London, is the next curator of the Oslo Triennale, work for what today is considered one of the most important, no? The zine magazine, online magazine. So I think there are three important points, no? The text, the idea of curating exhibition, and working for an institution. So this is, it's the big difference, no? We are discussing with Marina at the beginning of this, of the day, about these things of, there is no difference but what my generation did and the new generation is doing now, but I believe that this generation is more active and more open to this, to the dialogue, to the discussion, and also the economical situation, the social situation in this particular moment. It's open to this kind of, to this new generation of architects that they want to transform our discipline. So I spent time not to write an introduction, but I want to say welcome to you, and we will discuss after your speech, so I will change some, just a bit my question for sure, and welcome.
Thank you very much for those ludicrously over the top and very nice words. It's a huge honor to be here. It sort of seems like tempests are the theme of British interaction with Italian architecture at the moment, because you have this program called Brave New World, which is obviously a reference to the Tempest. You have the British Pavilion in Venice, which is called Island. There's also a reference to the Tempest, which was opened by the poet Kate Tempest, and it's raining. So tempests are kind of in the air. Who here is a millennial? Yeah? Who hates millennials? Oh, come on. Any self-loathing millennials should have identified themselves on both of those questions. So I am Finn. I am that kind of horrible, obnoxious millennial that most people hate. I'm a part-time critic, part-time curator. I also run a think tank. I live on a narrow boat in East London. I'm older than my parents were when I was born. I own no property, but I'm in a lot of debt. I'm still on Tinder, and I'm approaching 30, and I really like avocado. So I'm a kind of walking millennial cliche, about to give a lecture about being a millennial, so this whole thing couldn't get much more millennial. You could all like get your Instagram out and sort of put the Jakarta filter on or something, that might work. But anyway, so the title of my talk, if it can be called a talk, comes from these guys. And when I put together this talk, I hadn't really realized that they'd be on screen for the entire time you've been sitting here, so apologies. But this is The Offspring. And in 1998, they made the song, The Kids Aren't Alright. But that, in fact, is a reference to an earlier song by The Who. So The Who, their debut album was 1965, and it was called My Generation. It featured a track called The Kids Are Alright. Of course, My Generation, the main refrain by Pete Townsend, who's pictured here, goes like this. People try to put us down just because we get around. Things they do look awful cold. I hope I die before I get old. And I think for Townsend, to get old is not necessarily to mean to reach a certain age. He's 73, and he's still singing this song. He's a sort of early baby boomer. He was born in 1945. I think it means something else. I think it means to fall into a sort of trap of indirectly and sometimes directly seeking to torment the young. And that theme of intergenerational tension is going to run through this talk like a sort of sticky black thread. So while I was researching this, I made the mistake of just Googling the word millennial, which I'd never really done before. And it was kind of amazing. Like, you ruined our lives. Millennial snowflakes blame baby boomers for being worse off. Millennials spend more on weddings than any other generation. Snowflake millennials complained of quarter-life crises. The problem with millennials is they're conditioned to believe they're all really special. Millennials like drinking at home because it's too much effort to leave the house. Millennials in London are hiring cleaners instead of saving up for a deposit. Millennials skip breakfast. Baby boomers read the paper, and other ways generations differ from their morning routines. Millennials are less entrepreneurial and fail more often. Millennials are less likely to always use a top sheet on their bed. I mean, that's getting specific, right? Salad over sex? Millennials would rather eat a healthy meal than bed their partner, says study. Is sex too messy for millennials, asks the fucking Spectator. So this is really weird, right? Imagine making claims as absurd as this about any other group in society, a religious group, people from a certain city, a certain kind of race. You would look completely ridiculous. If you take the kind of conventional definition of what a millennial is, in terms of like what years that's referring to, you end up with a population of 2,380,000,000 people worldwide. So it's kind of like blatantly absurd that any statement clearly doesn't apply to all those people, and yet we continue to do this, and it's kind of weird. Why is it? I think partly it's to do with age. Age is, we have a strange relationship with age. I guess it's partly because we're all scared of death, and we sort of hyperinflate the importance of age as a way of dealing with that. So we have a lot of laws that relate to age that would be very problematic if they related to other kinds of demographics. So I think a good example that constantly confuses me is why we're so keen on really high voting ages. I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but this is particularly a thing here. You have to be over 25 to vote for the Senate, is that thing? Whereas most places, I mean, from an outside perspective, that's just really weird. Like, imagine if you had to earn over a certain amount of money to vote for the Senate, or imagine if you had to have had a certain number of kids to vote for the Senate, or be of a certain religion to vote for it starts to break down. Even in the UK, which has more permissive voting laws, you can have sex with and marry your member of parliament 2 years before you can vote for them. You can die in the army 2 years before you can vote for the people who are in charge of that army. So age brings out this kind of odd side of us, but still, I wonder why it's so enduringly appealing. The sort of spew of insults directed at millennials is, it's kind of funny, but it's nothing new, right? Every generation has had to deal with this, which is what Townsend is talking about. In the 1907 Cambridge dissertation, the academic Kenneth John Freeman catalogues the array of gripes that ancient Greeks directed at the young of their day. This is widely miscredited to Socrates, so you might have seen this before, but it's actually Freeman, and he's listing bad manners, contempt for authority, disrespect for elders, love of chatter in place of exercise. Sound familiar? I mean, they're the sort of things that my dad would say to me when I was young. So there's a kind of theme here that we can see echoing throughout history. But I do think that with millennials it's slightly different. It isn't just the usual thing of oldies grumbling about kids. There's sort of something else. This fascination goes beyond that. Millennials are things to be ridiculed, of course, but they're also somehow idolized and scrutinized. This is... Oh no, hang on. There we go. This is a chart of Google searches for the word millennial in blue and millennials in red. And you can sort of see this extraordinary trend that people have kind of gone completely berserk. So, what is a millennial? Why is there this obsession? Is it justified? Is it proportionate? Are millennials interesting enough to merit this kind of scrutiny? Or are they, as the newspapers would have us believe, just lazy, anxious people with boring sex lives? And I think this is where it relates to architecture. I certainly have a boring sex life. Don't know about you. Traditionally, architecture's been quite kind of circumspect about the cult of youth. Kahn was famously in his 50s before he got into his architectural stride. Leverance kind of gave up architecture for yonks and then produced his best work in his 80s. Architecture was accepted as a game for old hands over young guns, and it was quite unusual amid a wider culture which venerated fleeting, ephemeral nobility, that architects still seem to value age and experience. Now today, that's changed, right? We're kind of getting used to very sort of obnoxiously young people like me getting platforms like this to rant about stuff. But that's a fairly modern phenomenon. So I spoke to Kath Slasser, who used to edit, she's the first female editor of the Architectural Review, and she put it like this: before the millennium, there was nothing, genuinely nothing, for young architects. Back then, there were all the awards for old farts, the Rieber Gold Medal, the Pritzker, the AIA Medal. You had to lumber on into your 60s or 70s before someone would tip you the wink. Young architects were seen as not having the experience or the critical mass to stake their claim to anything. So what she did with her then editor Peter Murray was this: the 1999 Awards for Emerging Architecture, which as far as I can tell is the first ever example of an awards program specifically singling out people based on their age for kind of early recognition. In the first year, it had 900 entries, and over the years acknowledged numerous then little-known designers such as Bjarke Ingels, Shigeru Ban, Sue Fujimoto, Thomas Heatherwick, now global stars. Since the turn of the millennium, the faces of emerging architecture have become dramatically younger as more and more institutions worldwide have sort of followed, not necessarily consciously, but have made similar decisions to start awarding prestige based to an extent on age. And we're going to see a lot more of those in the rest of this program. Mixing the virginal myth of untainted youth and the appeal of the authorial architect, we have spawned a new and seductive commodity: the young architect. So, this is my boss, Ellis Woodman, and he's a very famous critic, just in case you didn't know. And he was whinging the other day on Facebook that there weren't enough young architects at the Biennale this year. And I would sort of say there were loads, but maybe he was looking in the wrong place. But perhaps there is something to be said that the Grafton bit, the official bit, was a bit long in the tooth. But actually, I think what Ellis is craving here isn't really that bit at all. It's that bit. Newness. Part of our obsession with youth, and to an extent millennials, is intrinsically linked to a wider lust for new stuff, right? You can kind of see this in the language that we use to heap praise on work we admire. We call it avant-garde, cutting edge. It's radical, it's contemporary. Those are all just synonyms for new. This very series is called Brave New World, New Visions in Architecture. It has the word new twice in its own name. That's not meant to be mean, it's just meant to point out, like, there's something sort of slightly weird going on here. Why do we heap such positivity on something being new? And I think it's actually quite surprising when you consider that so many architects are driven by, or claim to be driven by, environmental concerns, are critical of things like retail consumerism, and aspire to values like community, health, and craft. Or they say they do. And then, at the same time, when it comes to architectural ideas, are consumerists, wanting things to be new for the sake of them being new. Newness, I would argue, is revered by our profession more highly than goodness. And in a way, our various biennales and triennales, whether they're Venice or Oslo or wherever, are never going to be festivals of the best architecture in the world. They're just going to be festivals of the newest architecture in the world. And this is a catch for the young. Because the AR, in a sort of weird way, has succeeded in popularizing interest in the genuinely young designer, just in time for the rise of the millennial generation. But it did so by linking newness to novelty. Young architects quench our thirst for the new. But for how long can that last? To adopt the young architect brand can grant some measure of fame and profile. It can even win you the Turner Prize in the case of Assemble, but always alongside an implicit expectation of diminished pay in a marketplace that will quickly get bored and move on. To add some more complexity, let's talk about education. Because millennials are better educated than any other generation, by a long way. This is not to have a go at baby boomers. In a way, baby boomers' great triumph has been to extend the franchise of education to a much greater number than it was previously. Not me personally, I didn't go to school, but my peers certainly did. So this is part of a kind of global trend. We can see this pretty much everywhere, whether you're in the hyper-developed world or the developed world or even indigenous nations. And it kind of extends from primary schools right through to PhDs. And the World Bank has some good data on this. So this is enrollment in tertiary education, which is like universities, basically. And if you just look at Europe, you can see that enrollment in the 70s is around 30%. By the time millennials are going to university, in the early 21st century, enrollment is almost double that. This varies by country, of course, but you can kind of see that the trend is very similar. Let's just zoom in on the UK and Italy. So obviously the outright numbers are different, but the growth in education is matching up exactly. So the baby boomers were the most educated generation of all time in their time, but their level of education pales in comparison to the millennials. Now, what does that mean, right? What does it mean to be aware of this context? What does it mean if you're a millennial and you sort of know somehow that you're part of this generation that is at least 3 times more educated than the previous generation, and yet the previous generation seems to be the one with all the power and the money? Does it make you feel smug, like you've sort of got something that they don't have? Does it make you feel frustrated, like they've got something you don't have? Does it make you surprised? Is it scary in some way? I think with this better education comes all sorts of weird side effects, but one of them is knowledge of the world, and that's, in a way, the big change. People talk a lot about the internet and sort of access to knowledge, but I think the knowledge that people are accessing is greater outright, whether we have the internet or not. We understand climate change better now. We understand economics now. We've seen what communism can do. We've seen what capitalism can do. You couldn't necessarily make those claims when my parents were growing up. So millennials have this implicit advantage of just more world experience to draw upon. Not personal experience, but like the experience of society. And I think you can see this playing out in the streets. If you look at some of the 21st century protest movements like Occupy, or Roads Must Fall, or Black Lives Matter, a kind of unifying feature is it's a very deep analysis, often of insidious and subtle injustices. And I think that is distinct from the laudable but maybe simpler movements of the 70s, like the Vietnam protests, or the campaign for nuclear disarmament, or the mining strikes in the UK. Today's political movements are multi-generational, of course. It would be absurd to claim that these are millennial movements. You can tell by the photos that they're not. But I think they have been influenced by this shifting, growing, society-wide educational boom. Maybe it's too early to say this, but I sometimes wonder if millennial morality in a few years' time will start to get beyond the old-fashioned idea of ethics being about good people versus evil people, and more towards an understanding of structures, that we are all, to an extent, participants in evil structures. So as Bell Hooks writes about sexism in 2000, remember that for all of us, female and male, have been socialized from birth to accept sexist thought and action. To end patriarchy, we need to all be clear that we are all participants in perpetuating sexism until we change our minds and hearts. So that's like, sexism isn't caused by like that evil sexist over there. It's caused by all of us to some extent because of the system that we participate in. So what does all this mean? So how long can we tolerate, given that context, absurd relics from a less educated time, like the penal prison facility, which there's just overwhelming evidence for is a terrible idea, or the nuclear family home, which there is dwindling evidence for is a good idea? These anachronisms are possibly on their way out, and the only question is just how long is the transition going to take? So what does all this mean for architecture? How does this weird situation of millennials as a sort of generation simultaneously vilified by the media, but then also idolized by the same media, reveal itself through architectural work? What salient comments can I possibly make about this 2 billion strong global cohort of millennial people, let alone millennial designers? I think tropes of generational culture may, to an extent, transcend continents. But who are we kidding? The kind of designers that emerge today are as diverse as the countries that they're emerging from. So in India, for example, Rahul Malhotra points out that 22,000 architects graduated the year before last, which doubled the number of qualified practitioners in the country in a single year. According to the Architects' Council of Europe, as I'm sure you all know, Italy has 1.25 architects per 500 people. Meanwhile, in Rwanda, there were just 46 registered architects in a country with only one architecture school in Kigali. At Harvard, it might cost you $65,000 a year to study there. In Denmark, it'll be free, and the government will give you $11,000 just to live. So obviously my hope is not to offer a comprehensive analysis of the global state of young architects today, because that would be absurd. But I'm going to try and zoom in on three themes, that three countries, and pull out some themes that I think reveal commonalities across increasingly hard borders. They are going to be the UK, unsurprisingly, South Africa, and Japan. So first, the UK. A country, hang on, I'm getting some water. I'll just let you sit with Harry and Meghan. Stirs national pride. A country which voted against the EU in order to escape the rule of unelected bureaucrats, but still enjoys a hereditary monarchy. So the 2008 financial crisis led to a deep slump in the British built environment. But weirdly, that meant a lot of new architecture practices. So a few years ago, the Architecture Foundation, we published this, and it's a book of the 100 best practices to have set up in the previous 10 years. And they're all lovely people. You'll reckon some of them are coming. Try this. There's Assemble, there's DKCM. They're all lovely people. But when we looked at when those practices had been set up, we kind of were surprised to see that that's the crash. And then there's this massive 2-year spike of new offices being established, often by extremely young people, like in their early 20s, let alone their early 30s. And then, once the economy kind of gets going again, it plateaus. So this seems like recessions are good for architecture, or at least for architectural diversity. And I think what's going on here is that a lot of the big offices lose work, they can't take on new staff, and so the kind of ambitious young staff say, well, fuck you, and they set up their own firm, and they try to like win little bits and pieces of work here and there. So these new firms find work amid the downturn in temporary projects and arts initiatives. A generation of firms including Assemble, We Made That, Agents of Change, DKCM, Practice Architecture, Arent, Baxendale, and Studio Weave, and many others threw themselves into this kind of pop-up explosion that found voice in a sort of explicitly provisional aesthetic of temporariness. So the roots of pop-up are kind of political, as you probably know. The British government in like 2010 embarked on this just epic program of cuts, and with little money to go around, small temporary projects was like a way of keeping going. But it also became a kind of fetishized aesthetic in its own right. So Studio Weave, along with Practice and Assemble, were invited onto the BBC Culture Show, which is a fancy pants TV show, and they filmed the interview and then they were cut at the last minute. And the producer explained that the reason they were cut was that their work looked too professional. And the producer said, the story we want to tell is about kids chancing into that story, and so we had to cut you. So it seems like austerity Britain liked the idea of young architects making architecture, but only if their hands were dirty. And this is doubly frustrating, right? Because on the one hand, practices are yearning to have a crack at substantial permanent buildings, and they're being pigeonholed into a life of wielding drills and 2x4. On the other hand, the whole discipline of temporary projects is devalued by its association with inexperience. Pop-up could and should occupy a major role in urban development as a way of kind of testing and refining ideas as part of long-term strategies, and instead it is used in conjunction with youth to get a quick fix for something new and shiny before moving on to the next big thing. And I think this connects to my argument about a weird obsession with newness, that we find it so hard to take prototyping seriously. Take, for example, the Cineroleum. I'm sure you know this project already. Fran can maybe defend it. But Assemble get permission to turn this derelict petrol station into a temporary cultural venue, a cinema. And they say, at the time, this is about finding new uses for the thousands and thousands of derelict petrol stations all over the UK. In fact, they say exactly, the project was an experiment for the wider reuse of the UK's 4,000 empty petrol stations. So here's an idea, which if it proves viable, we can sort of roll out for very little money all across the country, turning these kind of urban eyesores into cultural spaces. It is hard to think of a more successful experiment. The Cineroleum achieves gigantic media acclaim. It is published in Vogue. Its program of films sells out within hours. It launches the careers of Assemble, who within a few years become the first architects ever to win the Turner Prize. Like, as wacky experiments go, it's a pretty good one. And yet, 7 years on, 3,999 of those derelict petrol stations are still derelict. And this one's been demolished to make way for some shit housing. So, what went wrong? The test worked. Somehow, it was also the death knell for the thing, because we're so interested in stuff being new and exciting that even to do one more Cineroleum would have somehow been to betray the very basis of architecture's obsession with novelty. Even Assemble couldn't do another Cineroleum without being called kind of one-trick ponies who've run out of ideas and they're just pulling on their old blah, blah, blah. And I catch myself doing this as a critic when I'm talking about much more established firms and saying, you know, he's just recycling his old ideas. What am I saying? Of course he's recycling his old ideas. They were good ideas. So we just don't understand the value of R&D. It takes about 1.7 million hours to develop and launch a new Japanese car. But they have production runs of 1 million. So the research and development cost is just $425 per person, per car. And yet every single car and every single customer benefits from the full 1.7 million hours of design. A tower, on the other hand, can cost hundreds of millions of dollars, but with architects' fees at maybe like, what, 2.5%? Maybe a bit more if you're lucky, is only going to get tens of thousands of design hours if it's very lucky. Does that seem right to you? Dyson know how to do R&D. Dyson made 5,127 failed versions of their vacuum cleaner before the design was ever complete. Every single other industry has some form of quick and effective prototype. Filmmakers shoot rushes, tailors make toiles, writers write drafts. Architects make toy versions of their buildings, hundreds of times smaller, from different materials, and put tiny little plastic people from model railway sets in them. Who are we kidding? This is not a particularly effective way of ruthlessly scrutinizing and prototyping architectural ideas in a meaningful way for ourselves, let alone for the wider public. So the British Millennial Pop-Up Project isn't perfect, but it does have some amazing features in it. It suggests routes to an alternative way of lightweight architectural prototyping. It suggests ways of negotiating planning decisions and testing urbanism in a different way that isn't reliant on extremely wealthy clients. And yet, it's important to remember that this whole thing, all of those guys I showed you, they haven't emerged, like they didn't wake up one day and be like, you know what we want to do? We want to build a Cineroleum that ultimately fails to change the landscape of cultural spaces that will be gone within 3 weeks, but will make us famous. It's come from this kind of weird confluence of an economic crash combined with an industry that's just unwilling to give young people meaningful work. So, let's move on to Japan. Japan is obviously very different to the UK, but there are some parallels. Particularly this thing about millennials inheriting a very different economic context to the baby boomers. You might remember the Japan Pavilion from the 2016 Venice Biennale, which brought together 12 practitioners. So its curator, Yoshiyuki Yamana, says that the 12 represent this emerging generation of Japanese architects who are trying to make work in a different economic context. Once, and I'm sure you all went to the Maxi show, Japanese masters were creating these kind of incredibly authored houses because there was a culture of high economic growth, and you would just demolish and rebuild homes. And so there was always plenty of interesting, fairly blank canvas work for the great Japanese architects to kind of cut their teeth on, sustain their offices, and experiment with architectural form. More recently, Japan's economy has been stagnating, and young architects have found they just cannot net the same kind of caliber of moneyed clients that the previous generations did. Yamana, the curator of this show, says, in contemporary Japan, where unemployment, particularly among the young, has become chronic, and inequality and poverty grow every day, the high economy of the post-war era is now a historical event that belongs to the distant past. Japanese society is currently on the verge of a huge turning point. So that turning point is not just what kind of work architects can get, young architects can get, but it's also what kind of lives millennial Japanese people can aspire to. And the notion of the Japanese family life in the city that is sort of facilitated by the state has to an extent collapsed. As Yamana says, a new community based on sharing has appeared in its place. So let's see some examples. This is M&M, a two-woman practice based in Tokyo run by Madeline Kessler and Mio Tsuneyama. And this is their house for 7 people. So this was built in 2013, and it expands a small 1977 house. And it is, as it sort of sounds like it's going to be, a house for 7 adults to share platonically. That's not that weird in London, it happens all the time, but it's super weird in Tokyo. This is like, whoa, whoa, whoa. So you can sort of see what's going on. There's a big downstairs room, which is kind of an everything room. It's a kitchen, it's a dining room, it's a laundry, it's a workshop. And then in plan, this is upstairs, then you have the staircase upstairs. There are 2 bedrooms on the downstairs as well, and you have your bedrooms all facing outwards into this light-filled corridor, which looks like this, made out of like super cheap materials. So I think this project is really interesting, partly because it was done so cheaply and so kind of just matter-of-factly, but also in that it introduces just a radically different kind of living with other people from your generation to what might have been on offer for young Japanese people 20 years ago, let alone 50 years ago. That's one of the bedrooms. This is another M&M project, so it's a kind of townhouse that's had a similar thing done to it. It's been split into a kind of little family flat at the back, like traditional nuclear family, and then what they'd call a share house going up to the 4th floor. Again, incredibly tiny budget. Essentially, you've got this metal bespoke staircase, which is where all the money has gone, and that punches up through the building, and then the red oxide paint, which is what is going to stop it rusting in the damp months, is just applied to every surface to kind of create some sense of unity and architectural project out of what is an extremely rudimentary and limited budget. This is not kind of high architecture as it's been maybe understood in the past, but it is making it possible for millennial workers to live centrally in the city and enjoy some sort of sense of spatial luxury, even if it's a very different kind of spatial luxury to what they might have expected when they were children. Another example of this kind of trend is these guys, Shingo Masuda and Katsuisa Otsubu. So they did this project, the boundary wall. So you've got the existing hang on, when was this? 2014, okay, so you've got the existing building, again, like tiny budget, and what they do is rather than knock it down and try to build something from scratch, they just knock one wall of it down and replace it with this gigantic 4-story window. And I think it's rather great, right? It somehow magics this rather crummy facade into something extremely special and does it with extremely modest means in a way that's really quite chic. So the UK and Japan are both well-established democracies. And there's a kind of synergy there about how young architects are practicing a way that is constrained by economics, but in both contexts they're kind of looking to find new ways of practicing because they're literally locked out of the previous ways. But in South Africa, the context is extremely different. Apartheid ended 24 years ago, and architecture kind of weirdly played a role in that. A lot of architects boycotted the South African government, including, weirdly, the RIBA, which is not known for being a politically forthright organization. And there's various famous South African architects like Peter Rich or Rodney Harbour who refused to take any work from the South African government until the introduction of democracy. That happened quite a long time ago, and so you might have thought that by now there'd be this generation of young black architects coming out of South Africa who, white people make up 9% of the population, so you wouldn't have thought that there'd be many of them now that apartheid's gone. But in fact, that's not the case at all. And the reasons are kind of complex, but they boil down to inequality. Those 9% white people own upwards of 70% of South African land, and the top 10% wealthiest people in the entire country own 95% of all assets. So that's cash, but it's also like banks, it's mines, it's shipping companies, it's art. So the average black South African graduate is supporting 9 people when they leave university. And architecture is very expensive, and they've had to get into debt to study it in the first place. So there's this huge pressure to find a well-paid job and support your family, which is like your mom, your dad, your brother, your sister, your uncle, your aunt, your grand, and so on. So of course, young black architects are not taking the punt on being the next big thing by starting up their own practice. It's a far more sensible idea to find a big corporate firm which maybe produce poor work that is ultimately destructive to South African communities, but which pays well. And that's, frankly, the more important thing at that time. The other thing is that the mainstream architectural culture in South Africa is still very much rooted in this kind of colonial model that maybe is a kind of European model, a kind of traditional form of modernism where you have master plans, big strategic interventions, new pieces of infrastructure. Good stuff, right? But it's actually a problem because so much of South Africa's economy is informal, whether that's informal markets or townships or networks. And the old method of architectural production can cause more harm than good. So OnetoOne is the practice I want to single out as a little case study here. It's an architecture and urban research firm founded in 2012, and they and their peers are challenging this kind of consensus about how you do architectural planning. What they do is probably not really recognized as architecture at all, but more as social infrastructure, working intensely in informal communities, whether they're markets or townships. So, for example, you've got the Kwame Mae Market. A lot of passers-by just assume this is a kind of squatted bit of land, maybe, or some sort of crime den, but it is in fact one of the oldest markets in Johannesburg, and though it might not look like much to our eyes, is a kind of crucial site of trading and cultural life. So OnetoOne's approach has been to study the market, understand as far as they can its kind of social life, its hidden structures, its cultural happenings, its dependencies. So small interventions like a temporary table might be an opportunity to gather some stakeholders who otherwise might be invisible to a kind of conventional architectural approach. There was one intervention where they used the gift of lots of plastic stools and then through observation learned about the kind of informal communication networks that distributed these stools to where they were needed and then returned them to the center at the end of the day. Now, if this was a British project, my next slide might be of a shiny new market, and I'd argue that he'd been informed by all this amazing detailed research, but actually it's not, because as OnetoOne argue, that shiny new market might not be the right approach in the first place. And that's just a very, very hard pill to swallow if you're a conventional big practice and your business is making shiny new projects for people where you think they could do with a shiny new project. So in the UK, and I think this is really complex, because in the UK, the millennial provisional aesthetic inhabited this space that didn't tread on the toes of the previous generation. The kind of big guns, the sort of people who support this series, were very happy with the millennial generation and were often very supportive because they never saw them as a threat. Whereas, you could maybe call out the baby boomers for their poor environmental stewardship or hoarding wealth, but ultimately, in South Africa, the baby boomers were complicit in decades of racist government. And so the kind of intergenerational tension is so much more profound. And when young architects start to say, your old way of doing it wasn't actually that good, we've got some new ideas, it doesn't just challenge architectural strategies, it implicitly challenges racism and the legacy of apartheid. So, this is just like an example of one of the documents that comes out of this research process. Let's stick on that. So we've seen some of the faces and work of millennial architecture, and as I indicated at the start, it would be absurd of me to claim that this was in any way comprehensive, but somehow maybe it speaks to something. If there is a shared trait of millennials, it's probably not their love of a particular diet or an online dating app. It's probably not their sexual habits or their mental health breakdowns. It's that millennials are just aware of the injustices foisted on the world by their parents' generation, just as their parents' generation are aware of the injustices foisted on the world by their parents' generation, and they're trying to address them. Sometimes those things are small injustices, like commodifying youth into novelty in a way that marginalizes pop-up. Sometimes it's bigger things, like the breakdown of a social contract leading to a housing crisis that impoverishes the poor, further impoverishes the poor. Sometimes it's huge things, like abject failure to deal with the legacy of apartheid. In the UK's fateful decision to leave the EU, the marginal victory of the Leave campaign, led by this charming chap, seemed to chime with a kind of global rise of right-wing rhetoric, such as Donald Trump, Geert Wilders, and the Golden Dawn. But when the exit polls were tallied, a very clear schism stood out. 73% of under 25-year-old British people voted to remain in the EU, while over 60% of over 65-year-olds voted to leave. So Brexit, and it's the same with Trump, by the way, who only actually enjoys a majority of support with over 40-year-olds. Under 40-year-olds voted for Clinton, on balance. So Trump and Brexit were caused by older people, and both speak to a sort of generational war, the old pulling up the ladder in a pattern that's being repeated around the world. But let's not kid ourselves. I've presented millennials in an absurdly generous light. It's important to remember that as exciting as some of these stories kind of sound, their class has a solidarity that is based on no intrinsic shared experience. It's not very hard to imagine a kind of future where wealth and political power are concentrated slightly differently, and that millennial solidarity that this whole series is exploring starts to evaporate. Right now, middle-class British Americans care deeply about the housing crisis because it affects them. But you can imagine they might campaign a little less vigorously if a new prime minister started to give free or discounted houses to graduates. So what I've presented as a kind of global architectural response to generational injustice could be just a flash in the pan. And in a sense, the rest of this series will be the test of that. You've got lots of people coming, some of whom I've mentioned, some of whom I haven't. And the question I guess I'd be asking all of them is to what extent their values and work are going to change as they age. Because that really is the true test of generational morality, if there is a thing. Can it run the distance? And that's all I've got. So thank you very much.
So, all my 4 questions that I want to do to you are too old now. because I need to rethink what I want to ask to you. First of all, because you mentioned the word architecture after 35 minutes, no? And it's my first time that I listen to an architectural lecture and the word architecture arrived after 33 minutes. You show an image of architecture after 46 minutes. So in that sense, these things, it's very interesting. You mentioned school and no, the education. You mentioned the word education several times just to define, no, your position, but you never mention a school or a research that is, no, and you are teaching at the same time. So school is important, but you prefer to describe the reality and how your generation built the knowledge around this reality. So for me, this point is really very important. And so this is why I can start from my last question, that is about exhibition. No? You will be the curator of the Oslo Triennale. So to define not really your generation. No? When you are the curator of a Triennale, you need to describe your idea of architecture through this exhibition. And of course, everybody, me, that I'm old, also if I'm considered still young in Italy, but in Italy you are young until 75, 76, so you don't need to be a millennial to be considered young in Italy. But you need to attract my generation and your generation, no? You need to represent your generation. So first of all, I think that I make question in sequences, and so you can answer in, so I'm very curious about your Triennale. No? And what does it mean for your generation to build an architectural exhibition? The second question is about you are involved in the school, no? You are teaching, or you are working sometimes with the Royal RCA, no? Royal College of Art. So in that sense, how you consider the teaching architecture. So what does it mean for you teaching architecture today? No? And this is, for me, is another important point. No? And at the same time, I can consider your generation, that your generation is more attracted to this an utopia of the reality. No? So you are not talking about a new utopia, you are not talking about vision, you are not talking, so I very appreciate the when you say every time the people want to find something new, no? You are not interested in the new things, so this is, for me, it's really very important, and you are more attracted from how you can consider, no, the reality. In fact, as an architect, you display three different things. Your experience in England, London, and of course, that's, for my point of view, the most important thing was the Tanner Prize to the group ensemble, because this Tanner Prize give to this kind of language, they give the possibility to the young firm that in the moment of a crisis, they stop to work in the big firm because there is no more work. So what you can do, you stay at home or you work, you open your own practice. And of course, the first things is working on this kind of small pop-up project as you define them. No? So these things, it's related. No? The first experience that you show was the London one, so perfect. But this was created by the institution that they believe, in fact, an institution as the Architectural Foundation give to you the possibility to be in one important position, no, in the Architectural Foundation. So, for example, in Italy, to arrive you need to arrive there when you are 65, 68. So it's very difficult to be not new, because I don't want to use the word new, but you are fresh as a brain, not This is a question of freshness for me, the architecture. No? Yeah. It's not because I believe that, as you mentioned, the only architect, I'm very happy that as only architect, not two architects, but the first architect that you mentioned was Louis Kahn, that was considered young when he was 50. No? So he invented his architecture, his idea of architecture when he was almost 50. So, my question is about how you want to use this reality and how this utopia will be out of this reality. The second group of architects that you show is Japan. It's a very specific idea of living in Japan, and of course the scale of the project is the scale of the interior, the scale of the house, but again you select very fragile architecture that they define with their project one typology of architecture, that is the architecture of your generation, the people that co-sharing space of living and working and so on. And as a third example, you mentioned Africa, and of course, last year I was the curator of the Orléans Biennale in France, and we invite an architect from Nigeria that is 85 years old. Just because we think that this architect was really very important for a young generation of architects from Lagos, because they consider him as a maestro. So, from my point of view, and this is my last question, is what about what defining the imaginary of your generation? Because you never define this. No? You talk every time of the contemporary reality in different countries, but I'm curious about but this is the last thing. I'm curious about what produce your imaginary about architecture. They are architects, they are projects, they are political. So, I know that this is not really a question, there are more subjects. But,
no, there's quite a lot of material there. Okay, so I guess there's lots of places you could pick up on. I thought I'd been invited to give a talk about millennials and millennial architecture, so that's kind of why I framed the project I did talk about with this kind of specific preamble, trying to tease apart and critique the way that we talk about millennials, because I am very distrustful of the cult of youth. And I don't think it does many favors for other industries, right? I don't think that music and fashion and art, less so art maybe, are hugely helped by their obsession with very, very young people. So I guess in some of this you could read it as a kind of yeah, millennials are great, old people suck, but it wasn't intended that way. It was more intended as a more kind of discursive teasing apart of this from various angles, and hopefully I've offended all of you in some way, which I guess is my kind of job. You asked about how you teach architecture. I have taught architecture. At the moment I don't teach architecture, I teach architectural writing, and I do it in a program called the New Architecture Writers Project, which is a BAME only project, so there's no white people on the course. I'm obviously white, and there's some other white teachers, but the board who set this up are not white, and the students are not white. And the reason that we've done that is because we've become very aware. I used to be an editor at the Architectural Review, and I was very aware that there were very few writers coming forward who were not white. And I thought, this is weird. London's population is 40% not white. The UK as a whole is very white, but London is not. Why can it be that I can't seem to commission writers from different backgrounds? And the reasons are complex. They are to do with structural racism. They are to do with profound equality that's still a kind of hangover from the slavery and immigration and all sorts of historic things, and they're also to do with the way that race is constantly produced and reproduced, and it's extremely frustrating. And we thought, well, why don't we just have a crack at setting up a course that can try and make a dent in this problem, try and diversify architectural writing. Now, the objective people sort of see this project in different ways. I agree with Adrian Lahoud, who's the Dean of the RCA and one of our board members on the project, who argues that the project is not really to diversify architectural writing. It's what might happen if that happened. Because at the moment, we shut out this incredibly large pool of potential voices with different backgrounds and experiences based on a kind of irrational, latent inability to just grapple with kind of historic racism. And that massively inhibits our capacity as architectural writers to think broadly. So if you're talking about what might be a kind of more meaningful way to be obsessed about new things, I'd be obsessed with those types of new things. Like, who are the voices that we're systematically excluding? And yeah, well, maybe you can answer me another question about the Oslo Triennale. The Oslo Triennale is about economics. It's about a different kind of economy. This is going to happen next year. It'll be in Oslo. It'll be in September to November 2019. And it's going to be about economics. And it's kind of fun to talk about architecture and leave the economics bit out. But I think increasingly we're just aware that that's absurd. And if you want to have a proper conversation about how buildings are built, you need to understand, or at least try to understand, the economic mechanisms that are behind them. And so our proposition is that in the fairly near future, we're going to shift to a degrowth economy, an economy that is not trying to grow the GDP year on year. And that shift is either going to take place because there'll be some massive disaster and we'll just run out of raw materials and it'll be a kind of collapse, or it'll be a shift that we can design and facilitate in a way that is not just avoids that kind of trauma of that brutal transition, but actually enriches human life through the transition. And this is like, there's lots of academics who have been talking about this stuff for ages, but I don't think anybody's tackled it from a built environment point of view, which is kind of weird because architecture is such a big part of the economy, and it's such a big part of how the economy operates. And architecture whether you want to think about it as an artistic thing or a pragmatic thing or just as a job, it depends on what kind of economy you have. So that's the Oslo Triennale. Well, I mean, it's still fairly early on in the process. But in a way, our polemic is not our polemic. We're not trying to say, like, this is the future, here's the manifesto. It's more like, there's this big shift coming. I don't know if you guys have noticed, but it's coming. And we need to think about that. And then to hopefully open the doors to the architectural world to explore that through fiction, performance, conventional exhibitions, writing, and other media. So it's less of a manifesto, maybe, more of an invitation. Am I chairing this?
Thanks for your talk. So I hear what the last speaker said. The last questions were, and I don't totally agree, because I do think that you did have a kind of architectural statement going on, which had something to do with the marginalization of pop-up and resistance against this mode of practice. And I hear you, but I also maybe wanted to push a bit against that. Because increasingly I sort of feel that there is a dark, even perverse side to this pop-up paradigm. You have cities where the hard, centuries-long kind of infrastructure of cities, metro stations and everything, are crumbling, and increasingly these are getting, replaced with gig economy, Uber-style modes of transport. You have places like Flint, Michigan in the United States where the entire water infrastructure, the whole hydraulic infrastructure has been decimated. And so these poor communities now have to basically wash themselves and cook with bottled water, which to me is a kind of pop-up infrastructure. And in a sense, the kind of tent architecture and yes, on the one hand, it's flexible, it's informal, it's reconfigurable. But on the other hand, you could just say it's disposable, just like our plastic spoons and styrofoam cups. You know, so in a sense, I wonder whether the pop-up paradigm is actually the reigning paradigm of, you know, our neoliberal imaginary, and not and in a perverse way, you know, there is this dark side to it. And so my question would be, you know, to what extent do you see pop-up as the way forward? Can architects demand more?
Yeah, I sort of agree with everything you say. I guess my critique of prop-up is that it's what you're describing rather than what it should be, which is a kind of iterative architectural prototyping that is less reliant on the kind of big modernist project arriving suddenly and can develop with time and through kind of incremental changes. I think it is a bit, and maybe this is a millennial attitude, I don't know, but if you're developing an app, if you were a kind of hotshot web developer, you'd probably ascribe to the sort of Steve Jobs mentality of fail fast, fail faster, fail better. And that's a sort of design philosophy that's like, test it, figure out what doesn't work, do another test, make it better, test it again, sort it out, like constantly improve through iterations, rather than kind of trying to conceive this really complex thing like a piece of software or a new piece of hardware in one go and then just get it right first time. And I think that we use consultation as a kind of substitute for testing. We go to the community and we say like, here's our big idea, what do you think? And they say, I hate it, it's too big, or it's too small, or it's too, you know, what, blue. And then we maybe take on board some of their feedback, and that's our kind of version of iterating a design. But I feel like where pop-up works, it does that for you. You can test, what would it be like to put a staircase here? Could we support a market here? Is this the right point for a bus stop? And you can kind of figure it out as you go along. So I completely agree with your kind of condemnation. I think the comparison to the gig economy is a really good one. I guess I am just more ambitious. I am ambitious that we could have a better version of pop-up entirely. I hope that makes sense. Yeah.
Does this work? Yeah, it does. So I'm a young Italian architect. I'm just a little less young than Luca. Imagine I saw the first Who concert in Rome, and your parents were probably not born yet. But so I hope you will excuse my language. But I was particularly intrigued by this connection between the concept of newness and novelty, which you declinated in a very brilliant way, but mostly, I would say, in a sociological, a critical frame. In other words, to young architects like me, for example, architecture is the wise play of shapes in light, for example, right? Or the Baroque versus the neoclassical, or that kind of stuff. And so I was wondering if in your research you could, or you did, somehow spot some millennial language of architecture. Okay, which is not necessarily or not only related to the awareness that we don't have enough resources to do traditional architecture with, because, you know, architecture, after all, be built. It could be only improvement. Yeah?
Yeah. Yeah, obviously there are like very appealing architectural conversations that take hundreds of years to play out and you can see people like Peter Markley engaging in, like, is it sacrilegious to put a column in the middle of a facade rather than have two framing an entrance? And he's kind of engaging in a discussion that's been kind of ticking along for thousands of years when he does that. And I do think that, like, it's kind of cool in a nerdy way, like it's something exciting about that kind of historical depth, but it's not massively interesting to me, partly because I guess I'm a bit of a pragmatist, and in the context of somewhere like South Africa, you're like, well, okay, but come on, like, aren't there some bigger fish to fry? And maybe that is, I don't know if that's a kind of millennial trait, this kind of, come on, there's bigger fish to fry thing, but I have seen it a lot. I recognize it in myself and in other people, that there's a kind of dismissal of some of those more timeless conversations or slow conversations, because there's a perception of urgency, right? That it can't go on like this. Like, I can draw a graph that says when I have to leave London, and I'm very well paid, and even I can't afford to live in a house. I live in a fucking boat, and even that will get too expensive at some point. So I guess there's a sense that the clock is ticking, both in terms of climate change and in terms of social justice, and it's very hard to find the space, professionally or just intellectually, to do a Peter Markley and think about the right placement of the column, or when to break a cornice, or like how do you express materiality, which are all, this is sort of something I want to get into in the Oslo Triennale, because in a way, those types of things are what makes craft fulfilling, right? To make something, whether it's a spoon or a banister or a garden or a motorbike, can be an extraordinarily fulfilling thing. And part of what's fulfilling is thinking about these kind of tiny little nerdy things that maybe no one else can pick up on, or very few other people can pick up on, and really reveling in them. But we have a context of constant economic growth and a lust for new things that sort of squashes any possibility of that stuff. I have to produce content to get paid, and I need to get paid to live in the city where all my friends are. And so it's very hard, I think, to kind of take any of those things seriously unless you're quite rich.
I have I think it's more like a rhetorical question. Are we falling in the trap if we like use the label of millennial to talk about anything? Because when you started the presentation talking about how we are sort of different from our previous generation, we have Black Lives Matter. I can think of exactly 50 years ago, right, with May 68. Is it 50 years ago? Yeah. It was a pretty angry generation all across the world, right? We have the Prague Spring, we have the student revolts in Mexico, we have like the civil rights movement in US, like people flipping cars and things like that. So, Black Lives Matter is a continuation of that. I don't think it's anything different other than having like social media available. And then you show some examples again from usually the same examples we usually see, like, British, talking about the young. They love the young, they have the young British artists, and I think that's like spreading everywhere because it's profitable, right? You make a business out of it. And then we show the typical Japanese young architect, which is not new either, The metabolism, some of them were stars already in their late 20s. And also, again, that was in the late 60s, just to talk about it. Can we somehow find a way where we challenge the institutionalization of that sort of like empire power, right? Like in Italy right now, we still have, again, the Venice Biennale with our national pavilions, right? Like the British Pavilion, as you mentioned. So it's like these really old structures that we adhere to rather than to question them, like we tried to do 50 years ago. Maybe it didn't work out, but is there any way that we can create some sort of, I know that you were invited to talk about like the millennial condition, because people see you young and probably say, you're young, maybe you can talk about young things, right? But are we playing their game, right? Like, come talk about young things because probably you don't know enough to talk about old things. Maybe we should take a different approach, right? And try to question the not so young generation of architects to see if we can sort of replace them, or at least, like play with them somehow.
I think that we are falling into a trap to some extent, but that's quite a familiar feeling. Like, you always have to play the game to some extent, and I guess a good question about ethics is to what extent you play the game, and like when are you managing to leverage enough gains for your position or your kind of your values, and when are you actually just kind of perpetuating something that you fundamentally disagree with. I guess one of the reasons I opened with a quote from The Who rather than from The Offspring was to suggest that there's nothing intrinsically unique about millennials. There's a set of economic circumstances, there's a body of knowledge in the world, and there's a climate crisis. And those are the things that generate this kind of work. And I guess you're sort of right to say that like the Japanese work looks a bit Japanese and the British work looks British, and to an extent this is because we're having this conversation in a time of désir where like we're just very aware of what's going on everywhere, and so it'd be very hard for me to come and surprise you with some exciting new work. And in a way, I'm criticizing that whole culture of like trying to always surprise people with new work. So I agree and I disagree. I think it is a trap, but I think it's worth engaging with. It's an interesting trap, and if we can use it as a stepping stone to have a complex conversation about, I don't really care about generational tension, I care about like inequality, right? And so if there's a way of talking about the big thing through a lens, then that I'm gonna sign up to that conversation. That sounds interesting.
We've got a final question from our director. Do you need this?
Just a quick one. Has it always been thus, I guess is the question, in as much as if I look back to, I'm based at the University of Manchester, and the City of Manchester gave massive contracts to very young architects in the 1870s, people who were setting up their practices at the age of 23 and built unreservedly neo-Gothic buildings. So within history, what is the place of the young fogey, and putting your observations in a historical perspective? Isn't it, I mean, what does history tell us in terms of the interrelationship between age, innovation, newness, oldness, imitation, and other ways of doing it? Because it's not always the case that architects who've made new stuff have been new people, or architects, certainly in the kind of Mancunian context, it's been very young people who subsequently went down to London. Actually, they kind of did it the other way around. They started in Manchester, and it was the northern cities of the UK that actually gave big breaks to architects who subsequently went down and built the Houses of Parliament and the Natural History Museum, your Waterhouses and co. But there was a time when people and cities were prepared to give big, shiny projects to very young people. And what do you think it would take to bring that back?
I think it is coming back. If you look at the people that the Mayor of London has been hiring, they're incredibly young, and I think that's partly a kind of political decision to try and sort of shake things up, that there's a sense of like some civil servants in the Greater London Authority have been there for 40 years and they just do the same old thing again and again, and the administration is actively trying to knock them off their perch by flooding the kind of civil servant market with young, talented, but like ultimately like their main thing is that they're young. So I do think it's sort of changing, but ultimately there's massive incentive, there's massive vested interests in keeping the system roughly as it is at the moment. And I think unless we can tackle those vested interests, it's going to be very hard for people to change. Developers talk to me about this all the time, that, you know, developers rock up, they build their appalling houses that are too small and too expensive, and they say, we don't want to do this, like we want to build houses, we're interested in like how you do that, but our shareholders hold us to the fire. And, okay, cry me a fucking river, right? I don't care that much. But on the other hand, they've got a point, which is like, it's not actually the developer that's the problem. It's the massive vested interest of the shareholder class that sort of permeates through all these business transactions. And yeah, again, I'm not talking about like 100-year-old architectural conversations, but in a way, if you can't see the context in which a building is developed, see the patronage and the kind of flow of capital, then you can't really talk about where you put the column, because that decision will have been made somehow way, way, way upstream. And architects end up doing window dressing. But I think we should be more hopeful. I think that the public sector, at least in the UK, is kind of waking up to this. And it's not so much recognizing the value of millennials, maybe, but it's maybe just recognizing that, like, the system isn't working, and we need to try something else, because it's just getting worse every year. Oh, God. Oh, yeah. I've been warned. Yeah, well, the reason I didn't talk about Italy, and I'm sort of keen to learn more, there does seem to be like a widespread fascination in Italian architectural theory in London. I see it a lot in student projects. Obviously, there are Italians who come to the UK to study, but I think it sort of transcends that. And there's a lot of teachers who are kind of looking to maybe what happened in the 70s in Italy as kind of source material for their projects. And I'm not, you know, I don't pretend to know everything, and I don't fully understand that context, but maybe you can teach me something over Prosecco. Thank you.